And welcome to How Computers Work Under the Hood. This was a talk I proposed that I never thought would actually get accepted. In fact, let me just get a photo of everybody here because I didn't think there was going to be that much interest in this particular topic, but I guess I was wrong.
Let's all cheer for
But
computer
welcome,
architecture.
computer architecture. All right. And the slide deck is already available. I'm going to give you the URL in just a moment. So, in fact, it'll tell you where to get this anime theme for either PowerPoint or Google Slides. It is your pick. This was the other one I was thinking of going with, this particular video game design, but the random stars get in the way of a lot of the text, so I decided to go with the anime theme. At some point in the second half of this, we are going to actually play around with some machine language. So that URL 6502.c.systems, and I'll show this again at the end, is where we're going to play around with machine language. The slides live at globalnerdy.com/6502slides, and I've got some notes at globalnerdy.com/6502. I will explain why in a little bit why I'm using the number 6502. But yeah, if you've got a laptop and you want to follow along and play around, you can. Really quick, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Joey Davila. I'm a senior developer advocate at Auth0 by Okta, so the Auth0 half of the authorization company called Okta. If you have ever logged into ChatGPT, you are logging in using Auth0. And my real qualification here is that I grew up in the 80s and played with 80s computers when they were simpler and you could get you could understand the entire architecture in one go. And one thing I grew up with was the Cosmac ELF. It used an RCA chip. Yes, RCA at one point made computers. And the Cosmac ELF was a very janky single board computer, and I like to call it the Raspberry Pi of the 1980s. Here's a closer look at it. So once again, very straightforward, simple enough that you could hand solder it. It's kind of hard to do with today's computers. And here's an even closer look. Note that the way you entered information was you set some switches and then you'd press the in button to load it up, and your only feedback was that 2-digit display there. That is all you had to go with, but it was a lot of fun. It was a it was a computer you could program. Now, what you'll get out of this presentation, will it make you a better techie? Maybe. Will you understand tech, and I mean present day tech, a little better? Yeah, definitely. And this is my own personal opinion. Will it give you an edge? I think it will. Understanding the underlying principles of how computers work will probably serve you well in the industry for the same reason that, you know what, if you're in the automobile industry and you don't know what the 4 strokes of a 4-stroke engine are, you might be in the wrong field. You really should understand these fundamentals. The problem is we've been insulated from them as our machines get fancier and fancier. And just as a thought, this is something that they used to ask electrical engineering students back in the 20th century. How many electric motors do you have at home? And probably more than you think. The general idea is that if something plugs in and moves in a circle, there's probably at least one electric motor in it. And even on your computer, because if you have old school magnetic platter hard drives, there's an electric motor spinning those platters, and there's at least one fan in your computer. So even a so-called solid state machine like a computer will still have electric motors in it. And with that in mind, the thought exercise for tonight, and there's no answer, just think about it later on, is how many processors do you have in your home? And there are probably a lot more than you think. Now, you probably indirectly use one of these every day. Intel Core, that's in a lot of Windows, and earlier Mac machines, Apple Silicon in present-day hardware. And if you're on an Android device, Snapdragon or Exynos chip is probably doing the driving. And Apple has been incredible with packing transistors onto chips. So these are the M3s. I do not have an M3. In fact, work gave me an M1. I'm still grateful. It's still the fastest machine I've ever owned, and I have a personal M1. But these are the M3s, and the basic M3, you know, has 25 billion, but the top of the line one, I don't even know how much the M3 and M3 Max with 32 gigs goes for, but probably 4K? I'm not sure. But yeah, it's nearly 100 billion transistors. packed into a space about this big. And that brings up the question, what is a transistor? And here comes my favorite GIF. Basically, it is an electronic component that uses electricity to control electricity. That's all a transistor really is. And it's a replacement for an older technology, the vacuum tube, which also could use electricity to control electricity. The problem with the vacuum tube is it's big, it's fragile, it uses a lot of power, and it gives off a lot of heat. It's worse than an incandescent light bulb when it comes to heat. They're still in use today, especially for people who like the very warm sounding stereo amplifiers or guitar players who want that warm Jimi Hendrix-like feedback. It's the way these things amplify electricity produces a sound that's kind of hard to replicate. And there's also the mechanical relay. This is an older technology, but basically it's an electromagnet that just kind of pulls a switch into the on and off position, and that's how it uses electricity to control electricity. You'll see this in high voltage or high current applications. But really, we're all about the transistor, and the transistor is the invention of the guy on the left, William Shockley. And what happened was he founded a company called Fairchild, and Fairchild hired these guys. And here's the thing, Shockley was a dick. And the people who worked under him could not stand him and left. They became the Fair Children. And those 8 companies they started became Silicon Valley. Because what happened was people would go to their companies and then they would leave and start their own companies. And over time, Silicon Valley transformed itself from a bunch of orange groves and some aerospace and military to what it is today, the technological hub of the world. Shockley went on to become a hardcore racist and got into eugenics. He's just downright terrible. So this is his page on the Southern Poverty Law Center. But it is a reminder that many brilliant technologists are one lab away from becoming a supervillain. I'm looking at you, Elon Musk. Now in the 60s, a comic came out called Iron Man. And back in the 60s, Iron Man was all about transistors. Every early Iron Man comic talked about his transistorized suit and his transistorized jets. And let's see now. Here's his origin story. How many here saw the movie, the 2008 Iron Man movie? So it was set somewhere in Afghanistan or a fictional country near it. You have to remember, this is the 60s. So this was set in, the original Iron Man was set in Sin Kong, which was sort of a stand-in for Vietnam. And they used every bad Asian stereotype they did. So the bad guy in this case was Wong Chu, and very caricature look like, but that's the 1960s for you. And Iron Man's goofiest, there we go. Iron Man's goofiest transistor power thing were his transistorized roller skates, which he could use to conserve power because flying took a lot of energy. But getting back to transistors, yes. Transistor is not that old. Doesn't even turn 76 till December. This is the original transistor built in Bell Labs in New Jersey. But basically, they were just working with semiconductors, and a semiconductor is a material that conducts electricity better when you run more electricity through it. That's why it's called a semiconductor. It conducts sometimes, but if you set up conditions, it works better. But yeah, this was a very janky experimental version. But soon after, they started making full-size transistors, which look like that generally. Those are power transistors, so those are power amplifiers that you might find if you take apart a stereo. And they're generally used to either amplify electrical power or turn electrical power on and off, act like a switch. This is a transistor, what it looks like, but it makes a little more sense if I show you the circuit diagram version of it. So this is the circuit symbol. If you look at electric schematics, this is what a transistor looks like. There's a collector, a base, and an emitter, and it makes more sense if I actually give you the shower analogy of the transistor. Where basically what happens is, this is your hot water tank, and it feeds water into the collector. The base is basically your faucet. It controls the flow through the transistor, and the emitter is basically your shower head. If you provide more current to the base, you let more current through. You can even amplify what's coming out of the emitter. And that's generally all there is to a transistor, and what happens is we can use it as switches. Below a certain output voltage, we can consider the output 0 or false. Again, above a certain voltage output, we can consider the output of a transistor 1 or true. And once we have that binary system, we can start doing things. This is probably straightforward to you. In fact, this is probably where most computer explanations end. Oh yeah, we have a little switch, it can represent ones and zeros, and somehow they become programs. And that's where the explanations typically stop. JavaScript people, how many of you are in the house? Can you tell me what these are? What the result should be? False and false?
False.
False. False and true?
False.
False. True and false? False. False. True and true. Only true and true produces true. So that's what happens there. So that's a logical and. That is something we all know. But what if we take those ands and then throw them inside a not? So not false and false. What's that? True. Right. And actually, not false and true is also true. Not true and false is also true. In fact, not true and true is the only one that turns into false. And that is something that we have built, that electrical people have built in circuits for a long time, and it's called NAND, not and. And we can build it in a circuit using two transistors like this. Step over here. Output will always go through here until I apply current here. All right, and the reason is electricity is always looking for, is coming from here, the positive terminal of the battery, to the area of the lowest potential. Under normal circumstances, there's actually no potential here because these transistors are off. The current only has this way to go. So, false and false equals true. False and true still equals true. True and false still equals true, but once I apply current here, true and true, all the electricity goes this way. This is way more attractive. As far as electricity is concerned, this is kale chips, this is chocolate covered bacon. It's going to go this way. Electricity always wants to go from the area of highest potential to lowest potential. So, and the transistors, if I power them, open up that path. But this is the circuit version of a NAND gate. This is what that circuit looks like on a circuit board if you ever decide to go to Adafruit and take up some electronics kits. We represent this circuit with this symbol. This is the NAND gate symbol, and basically it's just that entire circuit in a tiny space. And in fact, we have had, since the 1980s, this particular chip. This is a quad NAND gate chip. It has 4 NAND gates built in it, so you can use it to do electronic logic. So you don't have to build this giant circuit anymore. We've compressed it and put it inside a chip. But great things happen with NAND gates, and that is because you can make all the other kinds of Boolean logic gates using only NAND gates. Hook it up that way, you get AND. So A and B there will produce an output of true. This is a NOT gate. Basically, just inverts the signal. All you're doing is feeding the same signal into both inputs of a NAND gate, and you get the exact opposite of what you feed it, and so on. But even better, take my word for it, we don't have time to prove it, but basically, 5 NAND gates, you can create something called a D flip-flop. Basically, what this does is, this can memorize 1 bit of information. A byte is a group of 8 bits, and in fact, if you take 8 flip-flops and put them side by side, all of a sudden you can get them to store a byte. And a byte can be 1 ASCII character, or basically the Roman letters and numerals and some punctuation inside the larger Unicode set. You need 3 bytes at least 3 bytes to express an emoji, maybe 4, depending on what the emoji is. And of course, these days, I mean, for development, we want 8 megabytes, so you need 8 million of these little circuits, which is why we need to pack so many transistors into a chip. Once again, we don't have time to prove that this works, but yes, with 36 NAND gates, you can build a circuit that can add 2 4-bit numbers. To add some 64-bit numbers, you need to arrange 16 of these in a row. But it can be done, and in fact, it does exist inside the chip. Inside computers, even a computer that's 8 years old will have a lot of these systems built in. But basically, by just taking a bunch of transistors and organizing them into NAND gates, and then organizing the NAND gates into these patterns, we can actually create a creature called the microprocessor, or the central processing unit. There we go, there's my picture. This is basically a quick block diagram of what's inside a microprocessor and what happens in it. And actually today is the 52nd birthday of the microprocessor. It only came out November 15th, 1971. This is the Intel 4004. It was a 4-bit processor. I'm using Andy Grove there. He used to be the CEO of Intel. He was the one who got paranoid. Before they did microprocessors, all they made was RAM. And they were getting worried, maybe we're getting too complacent, maybe we're missing a market opportunity. We should get into processors. So they built one. And it's the Intel 4004, like I said, the first commercially produced microprocessor, and it was made for this calculator, the Busicom 141PF. Didn't even have a display, only output on paper, but this was the first time that a microprocessor was powering a calculator. And it's not even a fancy calculator, it's got a memory, but it's basically what those of us who came from engineering school call a four-banger. So it could do plus, minus, times and division, and that's it. But this was still a revolution, and once again, not that old. Shortly after that came the introduction of the first home computer, the Altair 8800. It had to be programmed using switches. It did not come with a keyboard yet. It did not come with a display. All the output was those LEDs right there. And that was it. But it sold like hotcakes, at least as far as the San Francisco, Silicon Valley hobby community came. There we go. Absurdly high gas prices. 1975, there was a gas shortage. And I would love to see those prices. But yes, in 1975, home computers started popping on the market, powered by microprocessors. And one of the microprocessors is the 6502. This is one of the most important chips in history because it started off a computer revolution, made a lot of careers, including mine. This is the set of transistors inside a 6502. There were just over 4,500 transistors. It's not like the 100 billion transistors we get in a chip today. There are only 4,500. And at the time, Ken Olsen, who is actually considered a pioneer, he did say that he never thought anyone would want a computer in their home. And that same year, these three computers came out. The Radio Shack TRS-80, aka the Trash 80, the Commodore PET, and the Apple II. And I was an Apple IIe owner. And it was created by these two people. Actually, it was largely created by Steve Wozniak. Jobs was the marketing guy. Bit of a jerk, but once again, you know, tech leaders, one lab accident away from becoming a supervillain. And these were some of the computers that were powered by the 6502 chip, including the PET, the Apple II, the Commodore 64 and VIC-20, the Atari 400, the BBC Micro, the Acorn Atom. Those last two were British computers, not seen too much in the US. I'm originally from Canada, so I saw one once in real life. And a bunch of video game consoles were powered by the 6502, including the Atari 2600, the Atari 5200, the Nintendo Famicom, which came to the US as the Nintendo Entertainment System. And Bender is powered by a 6502. It was a little joke that the Futurama people put in, but yeah, at one point when they're examining his head, yeah, they say there's a 6502 chip. And in the original Terminator movie, when he is looking at people, they're actually showing 6502 code from an Apple II overlaid. So that's the original, the original Terminator. Give me your clothes, give me your motorbike, you know, that one. And it is still in use today. It used in input devices, things that need some processing power, but not that much. Monitors, toys, microwaves, that kind of thing. So it's still in use today, and people also like programming brand new games for the Nintendo that never existed before, and they just they play them on their Nintendo emulator. And one of the reasons I'm looking at this is because modern processors are like modern cars. Everything is hidden. This is a present-day Toyota. Everything's hidden under plastic. You will never learn. If you go to Auto Shop, you are not going to learn on this car. You are going to learn on this car. Yes, it's old. Yes, it's a bit janky, but you can find everything. I know where the air filter here is. I know where the spark plugs are. I can identify the dipstick. There's the radiator. It's all there. You can see it. And that's why I'm looking at old chips. So once again, today's chips, billions of transistors. The 6502, thousands of transistors. So a million times fewer, easier to work with, easier to understand. Before we dive any deeper, I just want to make sure we're all clear on our hexadecimal numbers. And this is easy. What color is this?
White.
Red.
No, well, yeah, not the color of the letters, but the color the value represents. So somebody said red, and that is correct.
Green.
What about this value? Green. Right. And this one? Blue. Now, has anybody ever wondered why we use hex instead of decimal?
256 positions.
Yeah. Well, there is, yeah, and that's, and okay, first of all, yeah, that's the, yeah. And the reason you knew is because, of course, the first two digits are red, second two digits are green, third are blue, but basically because a hexadecimal digit is just 4 binary digits squished together. It's just easier to express because the last thing I want to do is say, oh yeah, I need the web page, I need it to be 111111, and and so on. That's what hexadecimal is for. It's an easy way to work with binary numbers by just grouping them in 4s. And because they are grouped binary numbers, they map better onto the underlying architecture of the computer. That's why we still work with hexadecimal numbers, despite the fact that our computers, work, primarily when we display stuff to the user, we're doing decimal because that's what everybody knows. Here's just a quick binary to decimal, binary, hexadecimal chart. But basically, every time you see a hexadecimal digit, just think it's just 4 binary digits just represented by one thing. Now here's the deep, dark, under the hood secret of computers. And that is all they do is they shuffle numbers back and forth between something we call memory. Now, the CPU, or a microprocessor, just basically sees the world as memory. You may think that these are random numbers I picked right here. This is actually a really quick program. Think of memory, or basically the CPU views the world as a giant spreadsheet with 2 columns. Or basically, actually just a 1-column spreadsheet, but one where there's a cell number and one where there's the data inside that cell. The cell number is called an address. And basically, it's just a number, and stored inside there is a value. You may want to think of it as a JavaScript object or even just an array. Actually, it's probably more accurate to say it's kind of like an array. But that's all there is to it. It's just that these memory locations could be RAM or it could be devices. So this is the 6502 chip, and these are its pins. And the way it communicates with memory is it has these red mark pins here. These are address pins. So when it wants to communicate with a specific area of memory, a specific cell of memory, it forms the binary number, a 16-bit binary number, which means that's a number between 0 and 65,535. And that's how it communicates with that particular bit of memory. That could be RAM, that could be a sound card, that could be a pixel on the screen. And then what it wants to do is it wants to either read or write from that location. And it does that using these data pins, the data bus. The data bus on a 6502 is basically 8 bits, which means it can represent a number between 0 and 255. Normally when we say, we talk about 8-bit, we're talking about, usually when we talk casually, we're talking about blocky graphics like Super Mario here. 8-bit actually just refers to the size of the data that it can represent in one memory cell. That's why the 80s was called the era of 8-bit computing, because it used a simple chip like this. And that's basically all there is to it. And memory refers to anything a CPU can talk to. It can be a memory location in ROM or RAM, or a pixel on the screen, the speaker, the input from the keyboard, input from the mouse, hard drives. USB ports, whatever. And everything that the CPU can represent is basically just a number. And that number can be just a number, or it could be a computer instruction, or it could be a color, or it could be part of a sound. But basically, as far as computers are concerned, everything is a number. And this is basically how, this is a good block diagram of the computer. The CPU acts as the brain, and then through the address and data bus, with the address going, hey, I want to talk to you, and the data bus either writes information to that device or listens for information from that device. That's how it communicates. So it does have the CPU basically has a wire called the read-write wire. And when it wants to read information from a memory location, and remember, this could be RAM, this could be a pixel on the screen, or this could be the keyboard. It basically sets the read-write wire to read and forms the address of that memory cell it wants to talk to, and then uses the data bus to collect that data. When it wants to write, the opposite happens. It sets the read-write wire to write. It forms the address of the memory unit it wants to talk to, and then it uses the data bus to send the information to that memory cell. And that's basically how even today's present machines work. It does it in a slightly fancier way, but in the end, this is the general principle of what a CPU does. It is simply shuffling numbers back and forth. And to reinforce it, I'm a bit repetitive with these slides just because I want to reinforce the idea, because it can seem a bit weird, but basically every pixel on your screen is a memory address, and the data inside it is the color of that pixel. The RAM, of course, in your computer holds data. It could be, and that RAM could hold code, or it could hold a document, or it could hold a picture. And then the sound chip also has some memory addresses, and basically when you write data to a sound chip, it basically comes out of your computer as sound. Now, you might be wondering, okay, well, what about things like variables? Well, it turns out that computers, or microprocessors, have little hardware spaces that are built right in them called registers. And those function as hardware variables. Because they're built right into the microprocessor, they are the fastest memory that it has access to. So generally, that's where all the number crunching happens. A modern ARM chip in, say, your Raspberry Pi has 8 registers. An ancient chip like the 6502 only has 3 registers to work with. There's one thing called the accumulator, which is basically for reading and writing information in memory and for doing some math work. And then there are 2 registers called X and Y, which can be used for a little math work, but it's mostly for looping. So that's why in programming languages, a lot of times people either use X and Y or I and J as loop index variables. It's a habit that got carried over from the hardware world. You have to work with these 3 variables, and you have to, if you need more variables than that, you have to figure out how to make it work, and there are ways to do it. But at the very basic level, yeah, you're talking about a very small handful of variables to work with. There are also some other registers. We can't use them as variables, but they tell us certain things. There is something called the program counter, and that tells us where in memory the current instruction is, which instruction should be executed next. There is also a status register, which basically gives us the result, some status results of the previous calculation performed by the CPU. It's useful for a bunch of things. And finally, there's something called the stack pointer. And the stack pointer basically points to a piece of memory called the stack, and that's where we store temporary information. And we need it for a few things, and I'll demonstrate it in just a moment. A quick look at the status register. Basically, it's 1 byte, but each bit represents something. The most important one actually is Z, and that's the 0 bit. Basically, it's set to true if the result of the most recent operation resulted in the 0 value. Otherwise, it's set to false, 1 or 0. There are some other bits, including the B bit. I never knew what it does. I never use it. I call it, there's no name for it. They just gave it the random name B, so I called it Weird Barbie. If you've seen the movie, nobody knows what to do with Weird Barbie. Okay, well, it's that time. So yeah, we can now play with, what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate a few things using a virtual simulator. So if you go to 6502. c.systems, and I will do that right now on my machine, you will see this beast. And basically what this is a simulator of a 6502 powered computer that lets you program in machine language. You write your code here. All right. You can get some output here. This is basically the output console. This is a little graphic screen. We can draw pixels on it. There are 1,024 pixels across this. And this is a text area where we can print text. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, and you can follow along. In fact, actually, if you open, let me go back to the presentation for a moment. All the steps for what I'm about to do are listed in globalnerdy.com/6502. And it explains a few things, so you can take this home as well and play around with the 6502 assembler. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to type it in myself. I'm not going to copy and paste this one. We're going to do live coding. I feel like performing without a net today. I'm going to draw 3 different colored pixels. Upper left-hand corner of the graphics area. Really easy to do in a modern programming language. Here's how you do it in assembly language. I need to, let me zoom in here so you can see it. There we go, should be clear. What I need to do is I need to load the accumulator, that's one of the hardware variables, the registers, with a value. So I'm going to load it with the value 01. The $ means hexadecimal. The number sign in front of it, the hash mark, basically means value. If I don't put the hash mark, it's going to think I want to load the accumulator with the contents of address 01. That's not true. I want to load the accumulator with the value 01, which represents the color white on this screen. And then what I need to do is I need to store that value in the memory location corresponding to this pixel right here. And I know, because I looked at the memory map, that is at location hexadecimal 200. So this is enough for me to draw a pixel. What I'm going to do right now is I need to compile it into something that the computer will actually recognize. This is actually still too high level for a computer. So I click the assemble button, and if all goes well, the run button should be available to me. But there's also something called disassemble. And disassembly basically means I'm going to get a look at the code, the actual numbers that that my assembly code produced. And if I do that, I get that. So basically, it's saying that first line, load the accumulator with the hexadecimal value 01. It's stored at address 600, and these are the actual numbers that the computer recognizes. It's going, I have no idea what this LDA is. But A9, I know what that is. Then store the accumulator, STA. Store the contents of the accumulator at memory address 0200. Once again, the processor has no idea what STA is. But AD, yes. And then where? Oh yeah, it's just the address, but in reverse order. 0002, which is memory location 02000. The 6502 is one of those chips that's called little endian, which means its memory addresses are listed in reverse order. There's an efficiency reason for doing this. It's a little complicated, but it's actually more efficient if you present memory addresses in reverse order. So basically, store the contents of the accumulator at address 0200. And the accumulator contains the value 1. And if I actually run the program, boom. 1 pixel. Now let me do that a couple more times. What I'm going to do is I'm going to again load the accumulator. This time I'm going to use the value 8, which is orange. And I'm going to store it at location 201, which should be immediately to the right of the first one. And I'm going to do it one more time. LDA, and this time I'm going to go with, what have we got? Light blue, 0E. And I'm going to store it at location 202. Whoop. I don't want to store that value. So once again, the number sign means I want I'm referring to a value. Without the number sign, I'm basically referring to an address. So if I assemble the program again and run it, I now have white, orange, blue. Now imagine trying to write a whole video game this way, and people did. The games in the 80s were programmed in straight up assembly language. Now, well, you could run it in BASIC, but it would be slower. Now, I'm going to show you a slightly fancier version of this program because, of course, this would be a real pain to try and draw a lot of pixels that way. So I'm copying and pasting from the second example in my document. All right, here we go, and I'm going to scroll up a little. This is a bit messy. This takes up a little more space. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the code here. But this time what I'm doing is I've got a bunch of pixel values here. So I've written them down in this memory location that I've marked as pixels. And basically, these are just colors that I want to appear in a row. 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2. And I want to draw a row of colors. So what I've decided is, okay, I don't want to have to load an accumulator and then store it every time. That's going to be a mess. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a loop. I'm going to use the X register because it's made, the X and Y registers are made for looping. And I'm going to load it with the value 0. And I'm going to mark this the start of my loop. This is basically just a label. The assembler will figure out what address this is and tell which way, tell the program what to do. And basically what I'm doing is I'm saying, look, load the accumulator with the contents of the pixels address plus X. So in other words, basically, the first time around, X contains 0. So the address I'm loading from is just simply pixels plus 0. So it's going to be this first byte 0. The next time I go through the loop, I'm going to bump up X by 1. So I'm going to load the accumulator with the contents of the address pixels plus 1. Then when I go around again, I'll be loading the accumulator with the contents of pixels plus 2. Every time I'm going through the loop, I'm going to first compare and see if the value I've fetched is FF. I'm using that basically as what they call a sentinel value, a value I should watch for, meaning I want to stop. So I've just decided I'm using the value FF, the maximum value, as a sign to stop. If it's equal to that, if I retrieve that value, I know I've done drawing the line. So I'm going to branch if equal to FF. CMP means compare. BEQ means branch if equal to the end. Basically, I'm done at this point. If I'm not done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to store this new value at an address that is 200 plus X. 200 is the start of the screen. X, of course, is the exact same variable. So basically, when I fetch the first value, in the end, I'm going to write it to the first location on the screen. Then I'm going to increase the value of the X register and then jump back to the loop. That's what JFP means. So all the instructions that are that a 6502 understands, the human-friendly version, they're all 3-letter commands, and they all. Let me switch back to the simulator, and I will assemble it, and I will show you the disassembly. So once again, all the instructions I wrote have been translated into the numbers that the computer understands. The program actually ends here. I usually end my programs with BRK. That means break. That means stop. And then the rest of this stuff is question marks. Basically, it's the assembler trying to go, I don't know what these numbers represent. These are not standard instructions. It's basically the data that I've written after. So basically, these are not, everything from here on down is not instructions. It's the data that I wrote to describe the colors I want to draw on screen. But because computers don't really care whether a number is instruction or data, or it could be both, it gives computers a kind of flexibility that most machines don't have, but it also gives them a certain kind of vulnerability, and I'll show you what that is. But first, let's run the program. So I've already assembled it. I'm going to run it. Let me reset.
The P in pixels is capital. On your label.
Let's see what's going on. Yeah, it might be a copy and paste thing. Let's.
Pixels.
Oh, yes. There we go. Let's try that. That was probably just a copy and paste from the word processor. But if I run it, there we go.
Oh, pixels gotta be lowercase.
This is what you get. So basically, I'm reading values from the bunch of numbers, and and then I'm loading the accumulator, and then depositing the contents of the accumulator at these memory locations. The screen starts at 200. And that's basically how you draw a line of pixels.
How many instructions does 6502 support?
Let's see. Generally, the ones you'll use most, there's about 35. In theory, it support up to 255 because 1 byte can represents an instruction. But really, yeah, it's about 50. There's not that many.
There's like hundreds or thousands today, right?
Yeah. Yes. Most chips have at least hundreds of instructions. Let's see if I can get this. Let's hope the word processor didn't mangle my instructions. But, okay, as a convenience, this particular simulator has a reserved address, FE, so it's near the beginning of memory, 00FE. And basically what it is it's a byte, it's a random byte. It's usually, modern computers these days have a built-in hardware random number generator that is driven by certain things like the time, whether your fan is on, how much current the computer is drawing, and how hot the computer is. And it uses that as a source of random numbers because it's useful for games, simulations, cryptography, that sort of thing. They're simulating it here. So there's a memory address. Every time you read it, you're going to get a different value. It's at location FE in this simulator, and I've given it the name random. I've also decided, let's make things simpler. I'm going to give a name to the starting address of the graphics screen. Instead of calling it X200 all the time, I'm going to call it graphics. And what this does is this draws on a set of 256 random pixels. What I do is I load the X accumulator, the X register with 0. I load the accumulator with the contents of the random address. And then I store the contents of the accumulator at the address graphics plus X. I'm starting with 0, so basically I'm looping through the first 256 graphics locations. Once I draw this basically draws a pixel, and then I increment the X register. That's what I and X means. Now I'm branching if not equal, and you're probably wondering, not equal to what? What happens is every time you perform a calculation, it affects the status register. The status register basically reflects the status of what the last calculation does. If I increment X 256 times, I go back to 0. And this really means branch if not equal to 0. So what happens is once I've cycled through all the possible values of the X register once and it goes back to 0, I break through. It is actually equal to 0. Otherwise, if I haven't gone through all the possibilities, I jump back to loop. Otherwise, I go to the next statement, which is break, which stops the program. And if I assemble it and run it, I get this, 250. Here's the problem. I can't use one register to fill the entire screen. An X register or Y register can only go from 0 to 255. This is a 1024 pixel screen. This is where I have to start using pointers. Be thankful, if you're a JavaScript programmer, you do not have to fool around with pointers. You can deal with references, and they're nice, but they're not as hairy as pointers.
I was wondering about that loop.
Okay. Here's where it gets tricky. Basically, what I've got to do is I'm using a memory location at the very beginning of RAM. I'm using 00 and 01 to store an entire 16-bit address. 00 for the bottom half of that address, 01 to hold the top bit of that address. So in other words, I'm using this to cycle from, I'll use this memory location to cycle from 0 to 255, and I will use this basically as a multiplier. So I can refer to more than just 256 memory locations. So what happens is, this time, I'm going to load I'm still loading the accumulator with a value from the random memory random memory location, the memory location that always gives me a random number. But this time, I want to store the contents of the accumulator at the address pointed to by graphics pointer. So those 2 bytes contain 2 values that define an entire memory address plus y. Then I increase y. Once I've gone past the first 255 values, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase x and then use it to bump up the second part of that address, the higher number. So the number that represents more than FF. It would be x100 after that. And I bump it again once I've gone through 256 locations, and I bump the higher number up 1 again. So basically it's like going, okay, you know what, the first time, okay, hex, 255 in hex, 256 in decimal is 100 in hex. So the first time around, I'm going up to 99, and then I'm increasing the larger part of the address number to 100. And then I can cycle through 100, 101, 102, until I hit 199, and then I increase the larger part of the address to 200, and so on. So basically what I'm doing is it's allowing me to work with 2 bytes at a time to represent an entire address. And if I run this, I will be able to color the entire screen. But now I've got to use I now have to use both the X and the Y register to spell out that address. All this stuff is required just for me to fill the screen with random pixels.
How much memory did the 6502 have? Or was it built in, or was it like an extra?
No, it was limited to what the 16 bits of the address bus, so that's 64K. Your LinkedIn profile picture probably is larger than 64K. Yet people ran spreadsheets on machines like this.
So do they use pointers to act like there's more? Like
Yep. Basically, I'm using a pointer, and I'm just going, look, the address of where I want to actually draw on the screen is stored in these 2 bytes, because I need 2 bytes to represent a full 16-bit address.
Yeah, I meant, could you get even further than that by chaining it?
Yes, you can work with larger numbers by chaining bytes together, and that's actually how we used to have to do it in the bad old days before 64-bit computing. Because 64 bits is a really large number. It's 18 quintillion. And in fact, that's how much. Does anybody know? Is anybody here from South Asia? Know the story of the guy who made chess and what he wanted as his reward?
Not from South Asia, but I
Yeah, but you're a math guy, you know. Basically, he said, look, this is what you should pay me. On my chessboard, I want on the first square 1 grain of rice, and I want you to double it for every square. And the king originally bought into the idea until he figured out, oh wait. Because by the time he hits the 64th square, he would have given, the 64th square alone would require 18 quintillion grains of rice. So yeah, numbers build up quickly. Let me show you a couple more programs. Let me see if I've got heads and tails. Oh, actually no, let's do Hello World. Easiest thing in JavaScript, like so one line in JavaScript, it's one line in Python. It is this pain in the ass in assembly. Here we go. All right, first of all, I have to talk about the beginning of the text screen in this simulator starts at memory location F000. All right, so I got to define that as the starting address. I'm going to use the Y. I'm going to use the Y register as my loop variable. So the first thing I need to do is I'm going to go, all right, load the accumulator with the contents at the address specified by message, which I've defined here, plus the contents of the Y register. Branch if equal to done. Basically, I'm using, and most C programs do this, we use the value 0 as the end of a string. So basically, if what I've loaded into the accumulator from this address is 0, I know I'm done. If not, I jump to the next line, which is basically store the contents of the accumulator at the address specified by the beginning of the text string plus Y. Okay. Then I increment the Y register, bump it up by 1, and I jump back to the beginning until I encounter that 0. Of course, when I'm done, I'm just basically executing the break statement, which stops the program. Everything else here is the bytes that make up the words hello world. DCB basically is a shorthand command, basically saying I just want numbers or bytes here. So I've got, and I have to do it individually. I can't even do it as a whole screen. So I have to do H, E, L, L, O. And this compiler is fussy about punctuation and spaces, so I can't use the space character or the comma character. I have to use their numbers. So 2C, hexadecimal, is a comma. 20, which is decimal 32, that's a space. What a pain in the ass. And then I have to spell the rest of it. Oh yeah, W, O, R, L, D, exclamation mark, and then 0 here basically saying this, I am terminating the string.
And you just did the hello and the spaces in the world to make it easy to read, right?
No, I have to do that, or I could have actually used the ASCII values.
Well,
So like I could have used numbers instead.
Okay, I guess I'm missing like why the second DCB. I might have.
Oh.
I might have spaced there.
I could have done it almost one line. This makes it easier to read. Hello, and then comma, then space with explanatory notes. Yeah, this is made to make it easier to read.
This is user-friendly assembly language.
Programmer-friendly. Basically, yeah. You should write your programs for people first and only incidentally for the computer that's going to run it. That's the general idea. Or basically, program as if the person who has to maintain it is doing your annual review. Okay, let me run it, and let me show you what you get for all this effort. All right, so I've loaded it up here. I'll assemble it, and I will run it, and here you go. Hello world. So basically, when you are running JavaScript, there is an interpreter that is going through the trouble of going, oh, okay, the user wants to output to the screen, so I'm going to use a built-in memory routine that will do all this work. But basically, I need to load a register from one memory location and then write it to the screen memory location and do it for every character in your string, even if it's a giant PDF file. Let me show you just one more. There's a whole bunch of examples, and you can play around with them at home. And it's the coin flipper program. So the real guts is right here, actually. So I'm going to load a random number, all right? And I want to know whether it's heads or tails. And I'm just going, do I really want to write code that says, okay, because this random number is going to be between 0 and 255. Do I really want to write something that says, if it's 127 or lower, we'll call it heads, and if it's 128 or higher, we'll call it tails? And I'm going, no, that is not binary. That's not the way we do it. So what I've decided to do was load the accumulator with that random value, and then end it with 0, 1. Does anybody know why this works?
Either out.
Yeah.
Only if the last bit is a 1, it'll be 1, which will be true, and if it's a 0,
That's basically it. I am masking out the leftmost 7 bits, preserving the rightmost bit. So I'm either going to get 0 or 1, which is good enough for this. Which is good enough for this kind of simulation. That's fine. So basically, at this point, immediately after this instruction, the accumulator now contains either 0 or 1. And the BEQ command means branch if equal to 0. So basically, if it's 0, I'm treating it as tails. So I'm going to jump to the part of the program called print tails. Otherwise, I'll drop to the next line, which is just print heads. Now, what I'm doing here is I am calling a built-in subroutine this time, CHR out, which is short for character out. All it does is it outputs onto the text area of the screen the character that happens to be stored in the accumulator. And what I'm doing is I've just got it. I'm basically having it print the value stored in heads, which is down here. Here are heads and tails. Oh, if you can put up with 5 more minutes, I will show you how the internet worm happened. This is a buffer overrun. This is what happens when I don't put a break statement in my code. So really simply, I've just got really simple code here. I want to load the accumulator with the value FF, load X register with FE, load Y register with FD. But notice, I haven't stopped the program here. And I've decided to throw some extra bytes in here. Perhaps it could have been data. A901, but the processor recognizes that as, oh, A9, that means load the accumulator with the value after it, 1. A2, oh, that means load the X register with the value after it, which happens to be 02, how nice. A0, oh, I know that one, that's load the Y register with the value after it, 03. The debugger here is a very handy tool. It actually lets me know at any given time what the contents of the A, X, and Y register are. If the program runs as I intended it here, let's say I fail to stop the program here, I would expect the accumulator to contain FF, X to contain FE, Y to contain FD. But the program doesn't stop there. So if I run it, if I assemble it and run it, notice what happens here. Let me zoom in. The accumulator contains 01, X contains 02, Y contains 03, and that was just all specified by this data. This is called a buffer overflow attack, or a buffer overrun attack. What happens is you just provide more information than the program was expecting as input, and it ends up living somewhere in memory. If this information actually maps to processor instructions, there's a chance the computer could run it and do your bidding. This is how this is a very clever way to hack into systems. This is how, theoretically, if you were a certain nation state that wanted to mess up a certain unfriendly nation state's nuclear program by futzing with the centrifuges that refine uranium to ruin them, you might want to do something like this. In theory, I'm not saying this has ever happened before. Google Stuxnet sometime. And then finally, one last thing. Do you know how local variables work, or why local variables work? What happens when you have... the problem with the processor is you're only dealing with 3 registers. Sometimes you may have to call a subroutine, and that subroutine uses the 3 registers. What do? What you have to do is, in this case, you have to save the contents of your registers somewhere. And in this case, it's the stack. So what happens, what I'm doing here is, I want to call a subroutine, But that subroutine uses the accumulator and the X register and the Y register. What have I got to do? I need to save them somewhere. I need to stash them away. So the first thing I do is I push the accumulator to the stack before calling the subroutine. So if I'm using it, I know I can get it back. The stack is basically a memory structure that's last in, first out. It's like a stack of cards or a stack of dishes. The other problem is there is no command to transfer the contents of the X register to the stack. I have to transfer it to the accumulator first, and then push the accumulator to the stack. And I need to do the same thing with the Y register. I need to save that too. So I'll transfer it to the accumulator, push it to the stack. Now I can call my function to do something that I need to do. In this case, this just draws a graphic line across the top of the screen. And then I need to restore all my old variables, and I need to do it in reverse order. So the first thing I stored was the Y register. But once again, there's no command to transfer from the stack to the Y register. I have to grab it with the accumulator and then transfer the contents of the accumulator to the Y register. I have to do the same thing for the X register. Pull it with the accumulator and then transfer to the X register. And then I can pull it from the accumulator. This happens every time you call a function or a subroutine. But the nice thing is it makes local variables possible in our high-level languages like JavaScript, Python, C# and all that. We don't have to worry about that because some poor sod writing the compiler is worrying about this kind of stuff. Anyways, this is basically how a computer works under the hood. You can fool around. With this stuff. Once again, I've given you all the reading. The slides are there for you online to play around with. There is further reading here, including if you want to play around with. I know Charlton wanted to bring his Apple IIc, but I've got an Apple IIe emulator right here, you know, and I can hit reset. And if I want to program in 6502 assembly code, yeah, that's really easy. I grew up with this in high school, so I remember this stuff. So call -151. So yeah, I can ask for a memory dump, but I can also decide that I want to program it in BASIC as well. But yeah, other things you can do is if you decide you want to program for the Nintendo and make your own new Nintendo games for the Nintendo emulator, you can do that. There are lessons here. There are introductions to assembly and low-level programming. And of course, more explanatory videos if you want to learn a little bit more about what's happening under the hood of your computer. Anyways, that's pretty much it. Go home, fool around with the stuff, and afterwards, just give thanks that you were programming in a much higher level language and don't have to deal with this nonsense. But at least you know how it works under the hood. Thanks very much. Don't know if there's time for questions, but we'll take a couple. Let's try. Now, the other thing you can do if you want to program in a modern programming language, actually the best thing I would say is the Raspberry Pi, and it uses ARM assembly language. It uses the ARM chip. The ARM has 8 registers as opposed to 3, and they're nice big registers, not the tiny ones in the 6502. And there are online videos showing you how to do it. But once again, you are doing things like working with memory a word at a time. Yes?
Could you briefly talk about cache memory?
Okay, cache memory, basically, all right. Cache memory lives in that space between registers and actual RAM. So the idea basically is that registers, because they're part of the microprocessor, you can get to them really fast. Like we're talking in 1 or 2 clock cycles, and clock cycles these days, you know, we're talking about gigahertz clocks, billions of times a second. Memory, RAM memory, is removed from the microprocessor and a good deal slower. It's also cheaper. The problem with register memory is it's expensive to make. That's why RAM isn't all, ideally RAM should be all registers, but that's too expensive. So having RAM is kind of a cost compromise. But sometimes that's not fast enough. So the idea is somebody decided, okay, look, chances are if I access memory location X, I will probably want memory location X plus 1. What if I got just a slightly more expensive, slightly faster pool of RAM to act as a go-between between main RAM and the processor. So that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fetch a whole block of memory and put it in this middle space that the processor can get to faster. It's basically kind of a faster go-between between RAM and the processor. So the idea is that most of the time you won't be accessing RAM directly. That's a little bit slow. You'll be accessing cache memory, which is much faster. So basically it's a performance improvement, but also a cost compromise. Otherwise, we'd have made all memory either cache or ideally registers. So that's the idea. It's a speed and cost compromise. It's always about how with programming, actually in hardware in general, you're always balancing speed with cost. So cache is a nice middle ground solution. Yes.
Could you go back to one of your slides where you kind of had it was like a diagram of all, it was like a diagram, you had like a 6502 and then it was like a RAM.
Oh, internals of the chip? Yeah, let me see. This one?
Well, not that one. It was after we introduced 6502.
Oh, no. I know the one you're talking about. Let me see if I can find it here. Oh, jeez. This one?
Yeah. Okay, so basically, you had that diagram where you basically showed that they write to the address. Basically, you have it writes to the address pins, and that's how it knows where to go.
Yeah.
What actually decides though that so if hypothetically the RAM was starting at address 00, what then decides 00, I know to go to this RAM here and talk to it? Is there? I don't think I'm making sense.
Oh no. What makes 00 RAM instead of?
Yeah, instead of the ROM or the keyboard.
Actually, it's the wiring.
It's the okay.
It's the wiring. So only certain parts of the address pins can reach are actually connected to the RAM. If it's not wired at that address, it can't be accessed at that address. So basically, it's hardware wires that determine what the address is. And generally, because you can address the first 256 locations with just 1 byte, you generally try and put RAM at the beginning because it's faster to act. The first page is always the fastest to access, and that's where you store the really heavily used variables.
Cool, thanks.
Any other questions? Yes?
What's kind of the difference between CPU and GPU access when it comes to writing the low-level libraries and so forth?
Okay, the CPU is basically general, is for general computing. So it can perform all kinds of, general processes, talk to memory, juggle things around. A GPU is a limited purpose CPU, which is highly specialized for vector arithmetic. So it doesn't do as many. So basically what happens is, because I was talking about an 80s computer, I didn't include the GPU here, but the GPU would just be another device here that you could access via the address bus. So a GPU would have its own address.
In terms of the programming style, the difference.
The programming style for a GPU is slightly different, but basically it's really optimized for vector arithmetic mostly. So we're talking linear algebra equations. We're talking about adding or multiplying arrays against each other, or an array by a scalar. And in fact, actually, the 6502 chip, being an 80s chip, did not even have a multiply command. Basically, what you could do is you could multiply by 2 by shifting the bits over to the right, just like you can multiply by 10 by adding a 0 to the end of a number. And you can divide by 2 by shifting the bits to the right. And then if you do enough multiplications by 2 and some additions, you can multiply and divide by anything. But it is a real pain. But that's the way you did it on an 8-bit computer. But yeah, GPUs are basically a specialized case of hardware, a specialized type of processor for specific types of operations. Generally, vector operations are basically doing array versus array calculations.
At the lowest level, are instructions nothing more than just groupings of transistors?
Yeah. Yeah, so there is a particular grouping of transistors inside a microprocessor. Let me dial back. Where's that diagram? Come on. And it is usually described as a V shape here. It is the ALU, the arithmetic logic unit. And most of the stuff is in here. So basically, an instruction gets decoded. An arithmetic logic unit can take up to 2 inputs and spit out 1 output. Most of the instructions end up encoded in here, yeah, as arrangements of transistors. Yes?
So that general layout still works.
Yes.
That's
Even
the-
today's ARM chips, even the M3 chip, pretty much is like this.
Just more, right?
Just more.
Yeah,
A lot.
Just more and heavily parallelized.
Parallel, right?
So yeah, think of this as one core. And of course with 40 years of improvements. Yes?
So I think I'm a little thrown off by this just because a moment ago we were talking about how you set the address pins in order to talk to the RAM, but then this diagram has RAM on. Is that just for convenience of talking about how?
That's largely for convenience. You can also view those as registers as
Okay.
well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But in the end, this broadly generalizes out to RAM. It's just that registers are very fast RAM built into the computer, into the processor itself.
Yeah.
I think I can take one more, because I should try and set the K-Force people free. Any more questions? Yes?
Using a flip-flop like pretty early on, or like a D
Yep.
flip-flop?
Yeah.
You said something like 8 of those allows something to memorize.
Yeah.
one bit.
A flip-flop will memorize 1 bit. You put 8 of them together, it'll memorize a byte.
Well, so what does it mean to memorize a bit?
Basically store that value as long as the power's on. So it can either keep the value 1 or 0 as long as you're providing power to the chip. The idea is that inside the RAM inside your computer is just holding ones and zeros in these arrangements of transistors, and those ones and zeros represent instructions or data.
Yeah, I'm just trying to
It-
understand how like less than 8 of those, or like you wouldn't be able to memorize a bit with just like some like AND gates or like NAND gates or something. There's something special about the 8D flip-flop thing.
Yeah, basically the AD flip-flop is kind of a self-feeding. It is basically a self-feeding routine. It creates a feedback loop that maintains the 1 or 0. Once you stop inputting to an AND gate, it stops producing output. But once you set a flip-flop, it holds that value as long as you're applying current to it, without feeding it extra input.
If you could call it the same question, why wouldn't like just a transistor is either on or off, if it's powered or not, right?
Right.
So why do you need a whole slew of them?
Why you need a whole slew of them? Because what happens is the values. You expect to keep feeding it different values every time. The transistor will only produce the same output if you keep feeding it power. By arranging it in a way like a flip-flop, you're basically creating the equivalent of a light switch. Once you flip it on, it stays on. Once you flip it off, it stays off. That's basically the idea of memory. It's basically providing a permanent storage of current. It's weird.
I guess it's more to do that once you want to know what its state is, then you have to
Yes.
have a way to get the state out.
That's right. That's the thing, is that you need to provide it an input to bring it to a current state and keep that state until it gets different input.
You hold the stick of RAM, everything is 0, it's off.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
But yeah, it is a mind-bending idea.
Yeah.
I say I'm just used to it because I've worked with it for a while, so I've kind of taken it as I've taken it almost as a unit of faith. But there is a little religion in computer science. You do have to believe in things you cannot see. All right. Well, I think we should set the K-Force people home, and I should set you home, but I'll be around tearing down anyway, so if you had any more questions, feel free to chat. Thank you for coming out and putting up with this deeply weird and esoteric topic. Thanks so much. I appreciate this.